There are 300 approximately machines in the museum. The one that I'm sitting in front of now is a Moog modular. This is probably the best instrument to sort of describe how modular synthesis is actually built up. If you want to have a look over here, we've got two voltage-controlled oscillators with varying pitch and waveforms and can be transposed over different octaves.
The closest you can get to the first analog synth was in 1899. And it was called the Teleharmonium, and it was a US design, and it basically manipulated electrical signals over telephone lines, and it weighed 200 tons.
Over the next 50 years, you had a no-holds bar on electronic music. Anything that could produce a sound by the use of amps, valves, gas cylinders, anything at all people would experiment with. First synthesizer that people would recognise would be the name of Bob Moog.
He came up with the idea of voltage control to manipulate sound. At that time, people used to make music on tape-based machines, chopping bits of tape up, putting it back together, and he had the idea of getting transistors and linking them all together to produce a voltage-controlled amp. Analogue's a set of, well, it's a circuit board that's set up with analog components. They're all discrete, so you've got lots of transistors, capacitors, resistors, all the rest of it. You link them together and you produce oscillators, filters, amplifiers, envelope generators, and everything else that goes into the synth. So everything that's in the synth corresponds to something on the circuit board, whereas on a digital synth, it's a microprocessor that's running a computer program to try and copy this, and I say try because that's all it can do.
When you look at most analog synthesizers, from modulars to the monophonics, you're talking about voltage control. The voltage control is a certain way of controlling the sound, whereby you have audio paths and control paths. With digital oscillators, you've got a different sound. You don't get so much variation because of a temperature in a room. Voltage-controlled oscillators gave a certain warmth of sounds, but they weren't reliable in that they would tend to drift in pitch.
It's more sort of organic in nature. It's electrons running around a circuit as opposed to just a series of ons and offs. So you do get subtle changes every time something happens. It's not exactly the same. So you get a sound that gently sort of wanders and moves about, which gives it a more realistic feel. Whereas the digital synth is more like a snapshot. It does exactly the same thing every time. So if you keep repeating what you're doing, it can turn out really boring.
To me, with synthesizers anyway, digital synthesizers sound like American film soundtracks, and analog synthesizers sound like young men having a great time.
the sounds that are produced from an analog synthesizer are unique to that synthesizer if you then listen to a digital synthesizer. You've got a far more richness of sound. The filters are still sought after even now that existed on the early synthesizer, especially the Moog synthesizer. It gave you a sort of a dimension to the sound which was ideal for live use and ideal for also studio use, but they were sort of the benefits, definitely.
It has its own unique sound, and depending how you shape the sound in analog, it can sound like Barry White singing in a bath, or it can sound like, you know, an opera singer having a good old wail in the shower. You know, so it's got a real breadth of sound that that can't really be directly linked to another sound. It is its own sound. It's unique.
This is the Orgon Systems Energizer. We're going to show you what it can do.
That is the wonderful thing about analog synthesizers. Because they were so unpredictable, I think that in itself meant that anything might happen at any one time in a live use, especially in the glamorous 70s when the musicians were sort of treated with not a lot of respect. They were sort of thrown around and all the rest of it in live performance. For a live performance instrument, I think definitely analog was the more fun to use. I think it was just something about the 70s that the monophonic synthesizers were always played as lead instruments, and then when you started to get to polyphony and the digital age, keyboards tended to be sort of pushed maybe to the background as support as opposed to lead instruments, and I don't think that's necessarily a good idea. I think that there is an analog revival, and a lot of people who are not used to analog synthesizers, who were never brought up on them, maybe never actually got to see them, feel that digital synthesizers is all there is. And I think they get quite a shock when they actually realize that what analog synthesizers can do. And I think the revival, to me, is obvious in that there's lots that can be learnt by our past, and I think that digital synthesizers may be looked upon in 20 years' time as being something wonderful. Maybe it's because we haven't been in the digital age long enough to really appreciate them. That is possible. But I think for the amount of people are turning the clock back, going back to technology of 25 years ago, that in itself means that something is missing in today's technology. I think by nature, I think people and society is very analog in that digital is too predictable, it's too computerized, and I think we are far from it. I think that the way we live our lives and produce music and do just about anything is very much a case of how we wake up that morning, and everything we do is so unpredictable, how we're going to react to different situations. and so that we're not machines. And I think that is why, as far as I'm concerned, most of the best pieces of music that have ever been composed are done in a very analogue way, not a digital way.